Hi, I'm Pastor Scott Fredrickson at First Lutheran Church here in Blair, Nebraska, and welcome you to our ongoing Bible study in the Gospel of Mark. Tonight we're looking at chapter 5 in the Gospel of Mark, beginning at the first verse. Now there are three very good stories in this particular chapter that we want to look at and highlight a little bit about what's going on in each one. So let's begin. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verse 1. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he, that is Jesus, had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs met him with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces. And no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran down and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and were drowned in the sea. Now the swineherds ran off and told it to the city and in the country. And the people came to see what had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion. And they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Well, then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with them. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home and to your friends, and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. So we'll stop here for just a second. I want to highlight something very interesting in this particular story. So let me tell you that back in the days when I was learning Greek, we took reading the Bible in Greek back when I was in college, it didn't usually happen until the end of our second year. So we had already been reading Greek in places like Plato and Aristotle and all those other ancient Greeks before we tackled the Bible. And there was about a half dozen of us who were studying Greek in those days. And this particular course that we had when we got to reading the New Testament and other writings from that time in Greek, we met in the basement of our library. And we met at 9 o'clock in the morning, too. So it was a morning class, 9 o'clock, Monday through Thursday. It was just what it was. But we were all kind of, had been together now for a year or two. And so we all kind of knew each other, and it was all pretty good. And, all of those folks that I was with, they were all very smart. And then they had me. So, there's always somebody to bring down the curve. So we got to reading this story, and the guy who was reading it, what we would do is that we get into the class. It's not too unlike what we do here. We'd read the story in Greek. The professor would talk about it a little bit. We'd translate it as we go, and he at this time would point out what was going on. So my friend was reading this story, and as he was reading it along, he got to this point in the story where he was saying in Greek, when Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" and he replied, and when he was reading it, he said, my name is Legion, said it in Greek, but he said Legion. And what was interesting when he said that, because that's not how you pronounce that word in Greek. And the person who was reading it, he was a French student. He was studying French. And that's precisely how you pronounce that word in French. but not how you pronounce it in Greek. In Greek, you say legeo. All right, so you give the G kind of a hard sound, like your leg, okay, like you would in leg. But in French, you pronounce it legeo. And so he was reading along and he said, my name is Legion, but he said it in Greek using Legion. And the professor stopped and said, if only that was the demon's name. And I've always found that phrasing of that particular question to be important. If only that was the demon's name. I mean, when you think about a name, what's a name? Well, a name is a way in which you begin to describe something. It's a way in which you begin to know something. And in Greek, Jesus would not have known this demon as Legion. He would have known this demon as Legeo, or some version of that. You see, the demon had a name. And what's interesting is we read in the Gospel of Mark, we're trying to figure out who Jesus is. And how we pronounce his name may not be the most important thing about Jesus. But if we don't pronounce the name properly, how are we going to get the demon to respond? If Jesus lives in a world where these demons have names, and where the Son of God has a name. You know, there were a lot of Jewish people who believed in the Son of God. What they didn't believe was that the Son of God was named Jesus, son of Joseph, son of Mary, from Nazareth in Galilee. In other words, you could believe that there was a Son of God coming, you could believe in Jesus, but you couldn't put the two together. And when my friend was reading this a long time ago now, and he mispronounced the name because he had too much French in him, I guess, I don't know, and said Legion instead of Legeo. My professor, who also knew French, made what he thought was kind of a funny, witty joke. But it was more than that. It was pointing out the importance of what Jesus is about in understanding and being part of that world where demons have names. And this name, Legion, of course, as we say now, Legion as Jesus would have said it, this Legion is important because it's the name of the Roman army. And so what's going on here is there's a story being told about Jesus who goes to a place in the Decapolis, okay, which is a non-Jewish place. Decapolis means 10 cities. And not only does he throw out of the man the unclean spirits who were named after the Roman occupational forces, but they go into swine, which are unclean food for Jewish people. I mean, whether this story happened as Mark wrote it or not, it is a clear indication that Jesus has power not only amongst those Jewish people for whom he was born and raised, but Jesus also has power over the Roman armies and over those things which are Gentile, that is, non-Jewish. The power of Jesus, the Christ of God, is not restricted into just these particular ways of being Jewish. The power of Jesus as the Son of God is universal and stretches to all people. In fact, it's so universal that it just exudes from Jesus. This power just exudes from Jesus without him seeming to be able to control it. So listen to how Mark tells this story, picking up again on verse 21 in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. And then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came in, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. And now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and she had spent all she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. And she had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch the hem of his clothes, I will be made well." And immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to all to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." What is going on here? Here, Jesus heals a woman who just reaches out to touch the hem of his garment. There's a beautiful song by Sam Cooke. I could touch just the hem of his garment. I mean, that this woman just knows that there's something about Jesus, and if she could just touch him, she would be healed. Nobody else has been able to heal her for 12 years. Nobody else has been able to cure her. She spent everything that she had. And if she could but touch the hem of his garment, I know I would be made well. And she is. But notice what's going on here. Jesus, immediately aware that power had gone forth from him. I mean, this power is in Jesus. This Son of God is in Jesus. And it is just part of who he is and what he is about. And he can feel it draining out of him when someone touches his garment and is made well. Faith connects this woman to Jesus so that she doesn't have to ask him, "Hey, can you heal me?" Like Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, who asked that Jesus heal his daughter. This woman just says, "Hey, if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I know I would be well." When we get to this situation of seeing who Jesus is and reading in the gospel, know that for the people that are experiencing Jesus of Nazareth, it's not all negative. And it is actually such that the power of Jesus just emanates from who he is and what he's about. And Jesus doesn't have to make a conscious decision to heal somebody. He doesn't have to say, "Oh, look, there's a sick person, I'm going to heal them." It's just who he is and what's he about. Jesus is about power and healing. And Mark gives us a clue that faith is what's going to turn the tide. Now, we don't know exactly what this word faith means yet because we haven't had the mystery revealed to us in the story, although we know how the story ends. But as the story goes, know that Jesus, right, is pushing us forward. And the power of what's going on with Jesus, right, is something that happens that is even sometimes outside of his own conscious thought of what he is about and what he's doing. He's being pressed in by this crowd on this way to help this synagogue's daughter, and this power exudes from him, and he stops and says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "Boss, you got to be kidding me. There's 100 people here, man. Anybody could have touched you." And Jesus says, "Yeah, but somebody was made well." And that is that gift of faith that Jesus recognizes. When the power goes forth from him, it goes forth from him to make somebody well. And somebody believes in him, even though he doesn't know who it is. Somebody believes in him so that they were healed. It was a woman who'd had a hemorrhage for 12 years, who said, "If I could just but touch the hem of his garment, I know I will be made well." But what happened to Jairus' daughter? Let's read on. Verse 35 of chapter 5. Well, Jesus was still speaking. Some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he'd entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. And then he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. And at this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Okay. This one is truly a strange one. This one is leading us to say, who is this Jesus? That this power can go out from him and he can heal. But now he raises a little girl whom everyone else had thought dead. And what's interesting, of course, here for Jesus is that Jesus says, don't tell anyone that I raised her up from the dead. Just get her something to eat. You know, we're going to continue on with this normal stuff. It's normal that little girls who are 12 years old die. Although, to be fair, a girl at 12 years old at Jesus' time was much closer to a woman than she was to a girl. But nonetheless, there we are. That this young girl is raised from the dead for Jesus is something that is to be expected but not to be told about. And you wonder, why wouldn't Jesus want people to know that this is what he could do? Why did he send everybody away, for example, and only bring Peter, James, and John and the mother and the father in for the healing? What Jesus wants us to see is that the mission of the Son of God, the Christ of God, the Messiah, is not about all the fancy stuff like miracles and healing people, raising them from the dead even. There's something more to the mission. There's something more to the mission about what it means to be the Son of God, what it means to be the Messiah, the Christ of God. And Mark is helping us kind of navigate how we can begin to see Jesus puts these pieces together to become the Messiah, the Son of God. And he does it not because he has this power that just exudes from him, but rather because of who he is and what God has made him to be, and how in that he has become our Messiah, our God. And as we look forward to the next few weeks, as we begin to see and piece together what this key is to unlocking the secret and the mystery of who Jesus is, we'll begin to see even more. That stories like healing the woman of her hemorrhage, healing the Gerasene demoniac over in the Greek cities, or raising Jairus' daughter from the dead, are not examples of something extraordinary or beyond the limit of the Son of God, but rather constitutive of who he is, Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ of God. Let us pray together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. We'll see you next week as we continue on with the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6. I urge you to read ahead and to look back and try to figure out what the key is to understanding who this Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ of God, is. See you next week. Be well and stay in touch.